Oh, we didn't get. This is a from memory synopsis of Ham uh, Charles Bukowski's autobiography or autobiographical. It's fictionalized. He calls himself Hank Chinansky. It's unclear how much fictionalization. There's a lot of stuff that's almost certainly true. One of the primary theme, and it's something that probably seems very foreign to people today, is there's an undercurrent of violence. Uh, Fighting is semi-recreational. It also seems to be something that people engage in because it's like necessary to be ready to fight. It's just something that people. I mean, throughout the book, either people are engaged in violence or threaten violence, and it's really quite scary. One of the worst parts is apparently uh, Hanks, and in real life this is probably true according to a biography, not an autobiography of Bukowski's that I read, is that his dad was sort of sadistic. One thing that happened repeatedly is the old fashioned beating him with a razor strop. And I think very few people today could imagine how painful that must have been. The first occasion that I recall is because he got involved with fighting at school, and the principal, who also was sadistic, sent and actually uh, feigning to shake hands with a very young, probably between 6 and 8 years old, um, Hank, shook his hand and crushed his fingers. And just imagine a grown man doing that to a grade school kid. And to boot, he sends a note home, and his father punishes Hank for being in a fight by beating him with a razor strop. And his father seems to take some pleasure in doing this. He also, on at least one occasion, beats his wife and is engaged in an affair with a woman that he knows from his milk route. His father, at least at the beginning of the book, is a milkman, and apparently, from what I read, was doing fairly well. They owned their own house, for example, which was easier in 1920s than it is today. By the way, Hank and also Bukowski was born in 1920, and so at the end of the book, he's 21, and he, for some reason, it's not clear. He is not drafted. He later on gets in trouble over that, but basically, the very last scene, he is in a an arcade where there's like games like pinball, and the place is empty because everyone's either at work or off fighting, and Hank plays a boxing game against a 9-year-old kid who, interestingly, is perhaps the only person mentioned in the book who could, who with any realistic probability, is still alive. He's this little 9-year-old Hispanic kid who may or may not, assuming he was a real character, have been informed or seen himself and recognized himself from the book. And they play this boxing game, which the kid wins at. And now that kid would be, say, 92 or older. Uh, but everyone else, I mean, Hank or Charles Bukowski would be 104. His parents would be probably well over 120. I mean, probably, yeah. I mean, born either very early 1900s or late 19th century. His supervisor, he works at a place he calls Mayor's Starbuck, and I think that is Neiman Marcus. For some reason, he decided to. Well, he fictionalized. He makes up pseudonyms for people and places. Although he gives the real address of his house, And my understanding is that someone has purchased that house, and they have, the last I heard is they were trying to build a Bukowski museum. But in any event, he's writing about events that took place nearly a century ago. One thing he describes in a probably a very early example of his writing skill is he was supposed to attend, or he writes an essay about seeing President Hoover, who of course preceded uh, um, FDR. So this would have been early 1930s or late 1920s. But it becomes clear that he completely made it up, and his teacher, rather than punishing him, is fairly impressed. Anyway, the book opens with him meeting his grandfather, a guy who was probably born in the 1870s or at the very latest the 1880s, and possibly even as early as maybe the 1850s. And they also, for some reason, they're visiting relatives, I think, of his father. There's a kind of a memorable thing where they go and they visit. They visit his sick brother who's dying of tuberculosis in his early 20s in a sanatorium. And they also visit the wife and the two young daughters of, or I guess teenage daughters of that would be Hank's cousins. But his father's brother is, I think, on the run from the police. He's in trouble for counterfeiting dimes, of all things. And to kind of set the uh, living conditions of these people as they're behind on rent, and the two girls are alternating trying to scrape peanut butter from a jar and put it on a piece of white bread. It's quite sad, and uh, Chinansky, uh, Hank's Chinansky's dad and mom leave them some canned food. Um, we also see Hank's dad. They drive to an orange orchard. This is in Los Angeles of the 1920s, and or Orange Grove, I think you call it. And they simply hop a fence and steal oranges. And a man who owns the uh, oranges comes up with a shotgun and makes them drop the oranges and sends them on their way. And Hank's dad is really a very dubious morality. I mean, he felt completely entitled to steal the oranges because there were so many, but also, like I said, there's the beating thing. Let's see what are some of the next interesting events. I'd say one of the first things we find out is that Hank is kind of forbidden from socializing with his the other kids, but he meets a kid who lives nearby. He calls him Red, and we soon discover that Red is has only a partially formed arm, and they're playing football, which this kid he does pretty well at football despite his disability, and they befriend each other. But one of the things, and I had mentioned violence early on, that occurs is they're accosted by five older kids, and one of the older kid asked Red to throw him the ball, and he says, "Why?" He says, "Well, I want to see if I can catch it." And Red says, "I don't care if I can catch it." And then he tosses it on the roof to prevent the guys from taking it from him. And then, without further ado, the five guys attack them. Now, Hank informs them and says, "Well, leave him alone. He's missing an arm," and there's a punchline here, but they go ahead anyway, and they outnumber them severely. But soon it turns out that Red really knows how to defend himself, and he detaches his arm and he uses it as a club. And they hurt the other kids pretty bad and send them running. And it's it's a serious scene, but it's also, kind of interesting. Um, Red and Hank seem to see a decent amount of each other. They seem to be each other's only friends. They visit a public pool at which Hank is accosted by an adult woman. It's kind of a disturbing scene. And then, without telling him, Red seems to move away and he never sees him again. And you wonder, there's another character we don't know very much about. There is another character that we find out about later on, a man, I think his name is Becker in the book, who also wants to be a writer. Hank clearly has a talent for writing. I had mentioned the Hoover thing, but he knows he has some writing ability. It interests him, and he's a big reader, and he also listens to classical music. And I think I discovered that this guy, he does go off to war at the near the end of the book. That's one of the last scenes. The guy says, I don't have parents. Would you see me, to the bus station or something? And he says, sure. And this guy who's Hank has read some of his work and thinks he's a good writer, perishes, according to what I've read, during World War II. Um, let's see. Uh, there's a lot of, sort of an interesting thing besides the violence is there's a lot of sort of precocious, not actual sex, but interest in sex, and something that Bukowski probably was not aware of, but seems to be true. He marvels at the fact that his seventh grade team could take on eighth graders and in sports and beat them quite handily, and he wonders why his kids from his neighborhood, which is a poor neighborhood, who didn't get a lot of food. And one interesting aside was that it was discovered during the Depression. So this would have been when Hank was, well, throughout the 1930s, right? Or from 1929 until World War II. They discover in a vacant lot that some of the weeds are edible, and the adults, the fathers, fight over these weeds. So violence was a way of life with people in those days, and but also, so as I was saying, Hank marvels that kids who were disadvantaged and had less to eat. Although it does seem like they eat okay. They're I don't know if Hank's dad had to fight over edible weeds, and in fact, as a milkman, he was making pretty good money, according to something I read, like 7,500 a year, which that was good money. Heck, in probably 1960, you could probably do pretty well on that. I mean, houses cost $10,000, right? Um, but I read that kids who are, I mean, obviously, if you're extremely malnourished, you're not going to grow, but sometimes kids under stress will have premature puberty. And that's what Hank seemed to observe. Kids who were in seventh or eighth grade already having to shave. One of their coaches, a teacher at I guess it would have been a junior high or high school, but I think it was a junior high, would challenge them to a fight. And this 13-year-old kid, one of Hank's friends, actually beats an adult male. And they said, wow, you should be, a pro. And he says, wow, I'm only 13 years old. And that to me, I just never had any kind of experience like that growing up. We sure did not pick fights with teachers, but they did. And in fact, in another scene, they had played baseball against a team from another school and beaten them very badly. And then for some reason, they were about to start a fight with them, and they just scared off these other kids. there was no good sportsmanship, no congratulations. They were going to fight him. And a teacher, and then because there was no one to fight from the other school, they fought each other, and there was a fight that caused bloody noses, and the teacher um, broke it up. And Hank ends that chapter by saying the teacher had no idea how close he came to being jumped himself. Um, that reminds me of another thing I found kind of amusing is Hank describes a very studious kid. I've got to say, there's stuff I don't even want to say that, some very graphic kind of, almost sickeningly graphic stuff that Hank describes. One of the things, it's kind of sad, and I think it really shaped the adult Bukowski, is he had, during high school, extremely severe acne, which they had, this is pre antibiotics, for example, and they had no really effective care. And he was basically going to a county medical facility, a hospital, and having his acne was so severe they treated it with electric needles. And he had this for years, and he was um, I don't know if he would have been considered a good-looking guy, but he was probably normal and certainly above average size and height. And but his life it made him into a recluse. But anyway, he knew of a kid. So that the acne thing was kind of graphically described, but there's some other things which I'm not going to go into. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read the book or listen to the fantastic audiobook, but be warned. There's some sort of gross stuff. He knows this very studious kid named Abraham Mortensen, and this kid is will spend hours after school memorizing textbooks, and he becomes one of the kids on the dean's list, or whatever you call it, the honors list. And Hank doesn't actually befriend him. In fact, he seems to dislike him quite a lot. And the kid, there's some a very good reason, which I won't go into, that you would not want to hang out with this kid. One day, for some reason, they're playing. They're planning to play baseball, and for some reason, he goes by this kid's house, and the kid is, of course, on a Sunday studying. And Hank says, "What are you studying on a Sunday for? We're playing. We're going to play baseball. Why don't you come out and play?" And Abe agrees, but he says only for a while. And during the game, uh, they both go for the same ball, and they collide or something, and Abe's arm gets broken. That ends the game, and Hank goes home, and then soon their phone rings, and it's Mrs. Mortensen calling, and she is, of course, quite upset. And uh, his parents now know that he broke the kid's arm, and while Bukowski said, or Hank Chinansky says that it was an accident, they're very worried about being sued by the Mortensens, and they say Jewish lawyer. And but he ends the chapter by saying his father was, of course, very concerned about you know the losing what little money he had, but at the same time he was proud of a son who could break another boy's arm, and that's how that chapter ends. Um, Eventually, I mean, there's some other incidents. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting things. I just don't have time in a half hour to go completely through it. The audio book is, I think it's 8 hours long. It's certainly 6 hours long. It's a pretty lengthy thing. I mean, a lot happens. He describes friendships with people that he's not. I mean, he did definitely like the kid named Red, but there's another kid who seems to like him for some reason. He says to him, I think his name is James. He says, James, why do you hang out with me? Or I don't think he used that word because that wasn't a term in those days. He says, what? Well, maybe he said something like that. Why do you hang around me? I don't like anything about you. He says, oh, no, Hank, we're friends. And they have some exploits together. And actually, that friend's mom is apparently sexually promiscuous barmaid, and Hank gets drunk and propositions her. And this is something that comes up later on a little bit. But actually, after she seems to be willing, he loses his ardor. He realizes she's a much older woman and she's kind of um, anyway, he loses his nerve, and she gets angry at him, and he and runs him off, or tells him to leave. I mean, he was going to leave anyway. Eventually, he graduates from high school. He's surprised to get a job. His first job pays 44 cents an hour, which, of course, even for those days, it's an entry level job, but it's probably about like making $6 or something an hour. Which for a high school grad, it was probably about what a high school graduate would make today. And what he does at Mears Starbuck, which, like I said, is probably Neiman Marcus, is there's kind of two classes. There's the people who, well, I'll tell you this one. He um, On his first day, he meets a guy who's been there since the early 1900s, and they have some interactions. And Hank makes a joke, which is a fairly good joke, and the guy says, "Listen, my here all the punchlines belong to me." And Hank says, "Yes, I understand." But that was kind of amusing. The guy likes the joke, but he doesn't like that someone else told it. Um, anyway, there's the basically there's the people, the salespeople who make more money and they get commission, and then there's uh, his boss is sort of a supervisor of the people who, when there's an order, they come and they bring it to the salespeople, and the salespeople treat them with great contempt. And Hank's very happy with this job because it means he can move away from home. And he I think, uh, not immediately, because he first off, he loses his job, and the reason he loses the job is because while he's at work, the rich kids, he apparently went to a school that had a lot of rich kids going to it, people who had cars even in the 1930s, which I think was unusual uh, for those days. Uh, they get into a fight, and his boss is not happy. He says, "Well, they started it." It says, "Yeah, we can't have our people you know beating our customers." And Hank wins the fight, to his surprise. But Hank's a big guy. He's like, probably, I think he described himself as being 6 foot and 180, which was not small for those days. It's maybe more normal now, but then that was probably significantly above average. Um, so he loses a job, and his parents are not happy with that. Um, Something happens to precipitate his moving out, and he moves to a very inexpensive boarding house. And I don't know quite how he swings that. He goes to, I think, a community college like LA City College, majoring in journalism. He doesn't take it very seriously. He moves to a boarding house. Um, which, bathroom down the hall. Um, he, I don't know. I guess, I mean, he has multiple incidents with his father. Although after a certain age, when it's apparent that Hank will no longer be someone who will put up with a beating and could probably beat his dad. There's no longer any direct physical violence, but Hank comes home once to discover all of his belongings have been thrown out on the lawn, including his typewriter, because his father read one of Hank's stories. And so um, I think his mom gives him $10, which, he was living in a room that cost $2.50 a week or something. So, I mean, $2.50 a week. So $10 was serious money in those days. And I think it's in Bunker Hill. which was like the same area that John Fante, who Bukowski befriended many years later, lived in. And Bukowski was an admirer of Fante. And I actually got to know via email Fante's son, whose name was Dan Fante. He passed away several years ago. But Fante and both Fantes are worth reading. I like Fante's short story collection, especially. Um, anyway, um, in this rooming house, there's some incidents. Um, I'm nothing as special. I mean, one of the last things in the last few minutes of the audiobook, or last 10 minutes of the audiobook, is he gets in a fight with people who have visited him. They play cards and gamble by flipping coins. And then for some reason, I mean, like I said, violence is always just below the surface. He punches one, and the guy falls down the steps, and his friend, I mean, Hank's friend, and also the friend of the guy who fell down the steps, says you killed him, which he could have, but he didn't. Uh, and the guy, revives, and they leave. And then his landlady is not too happy with the ruckus and threatens to call the police. And then for some reason, Hank, I guess, his landlady has a couple of Filipino boyfriends who are visiting. And for some reason, I forget if there's a really good reason for Hank doing this. He hits him in the head with a his typewriter, and is literally worried that that's kind of a pun. He hits him with a typewriter, and he's literally worried that he's killed the Filipino guy. And he goes and finds another place to live very rapidly. There's no computers in those days. You just pay your money and you take your place. And he finds a shack behind a house or something. And I don't know how long, if he stays there or whatever, but one of the last things that happens is he gets in a fight with his friend, the only guy he really seems to admire in the book, who's at this point, I think, has joined the Marines. They get into a fight. And then the last thing that happens is before the guy's going off to war because of Pearl Harbor, they go to this bar, and then I think he sees him off to the bus station, and then he ends up in that playing that boxing game against the little Hispanic kid, and that's the end of the book. And it's I don't know if it's the greatest piece of autobiography ever, and I don't mean it ironically. I mean, it's definitely a very good piece of autobiography. I don't know if it's as good as Remembrance of Things Past or other pieces of autobiography that are well regarded, but I've listened to it countless times at this point. As I said, the narrator, whose name is Chris Baskus, is a professional actor, and I believe he based Hank's voice on Bukowski's voice, and he comes up with voices for every character, and almost without exception. I think there's a couple places where I'm not thrilled by it, but for example, Chris does Hank's mother, who has a German accent, very well. And I mean, he does female voices convincingly. And, the narrator is a big part of one of these audiobooks. I hope I haven't disappointed people too badly. I'm going to end here. We're almost at 30 minutes, and we'll see how this sounds.